This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. This is one of those conversations for everyone. The topic, brain energy. What's the gist? Well, guess what? Mental health, you don't fix it by big pharma. You fix it with a different perspective. That different perspective today is brought to you by Chris Palmer, a professor, a psychiatrist at Harvard. His new work, Brain Energy, gets right to the heart of the matter. Look, it doesn't matter whether it's diabetes, heart disease, PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia. It's a metabolic issue, down to the mitochondria. At that deep cellular level, that's where all the bad stuff is taking place. But here's the good news. Chris today brings a solution. Now, you might say to yourself after our conversation, but that was common sense. Well, guess what? Common sense ain't so common today. Without any further delay from me, without any further setup, let's jump right in with Chris Palmer and discuss a little brain energy. Chris, here's where I want to start. And I've touched on this subject with another guest months ago. I want to bring up the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Let's start there because you've got a really interesting direction that you've gone in your work, and I'm really excited to get into it. But let's start with the foundation because that really is the foundation in the world of psychology and psychiatry.
It is. At the heart of DSM is the question, what is a mental illness or a mental disorder? People have struggled with this for millennia, really. One of the critical questions is, what is the difference between somebody who gets depressed for a clear reason versus somebody who develops depression that appears to be out of proportion to what normal people would experience, or in some cases, depression for no clear reason whatsoever. Even the person can say, I don't know why I'm depressed. I'm just severely depressed. This has existed for millennia. Hippocrates called it melancholia. DSM attempts to define mental disorders, and it attempts to distinguish these between normal mental states or normal mental reactions that all of us as human beings have. The challenge is that I don't think we've really got it right yet. I am not alone in that thinking. I'll just say up front, the National Institutes of Health has very seriously challenged the DSM and the validity of all of the diagnostic labels that exist in it. On the surface, DSM is helpful because schizophrenia is very different than depression, which is very different than an eating disorder, which is very different than alcoholism. Those are all very different disorders with very different symptoms, very different treatments. So on the surface, DSM makes sense. It makes sense that we would call those things different disorders, and we would assume that they have different causes, and we know that they require different treatments.
We would assume is an interesting phrasing.
Well, we would assume because I imagine you and I are going to get into that in a little bit, and I am audaciously arguing that that assumption is incorrect based on decades and in some cases centuries of evidence. The challenge with DSM, although it makes sense on the surface, is that if you start to look at real people with any of these disorders, number one, there is tremendous heterogeneity and tremendous comorbidity. And what I mean by those two terms are that if I look at two people both diagnosed with schizophrenia, they can have very different symptoms. They can look very different from each other and function in life in very different ways. People with autism, people diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, some of them are billionaire business people, and others live in group homes with mental retardation, seizures, unable to care for themselves. And we call that the same disorder, autism spectrum disorder. So one person is a highly extraordinarily successful person, functioning quite well in life, with meaningful, loving relationships. And the other person is unable to care for themselves and extraordinarily impaired in many ways. And yet we call it the same disorder. And on the surface, anybody who looked at those two people would say there's no way on earth they have the same disorder. That's heterogeneity. The other challenge with our classification system is that most people who get mental health treatment have more than one disorder. Although anorexia, for instance, seems like a good diagnostic label, we know what that is. It's people who are restricting their eating and or overexercising. They are grossly underweight, and they are tormented by this false belief that they are still overweight, even though everybody looks at them and knows that they're emaciated. On the surface, anorexia makes sense. It's a clear diagnostic label. But if you actually get to know anybody with anorexia, most of them also have other psychiatric labels. They also have depression or anxiety or OCD, a substance use disorder, or other types of disorders. And in fact, we have an abundance of research showing that all of the mental disorders are interconnected in ways that we can't distinguish.
That is a great setup. Let me ask one quick follow-up to get your perspective on one last aspect of the DSM. Big picture philosophical. We really can't, for most of these descriptions of these disorders. I understand your perspective, and I think it's fair to say on the surface, this gives us some guideposts to say, hey, schizophrenia and anorexia, not the same thing. In terms of objective, in terms of the scientific method, it'd be really difficult to apply the scientific method to many of these descriptions in the DSM today. Would it not be?
So it's possible to apply the scientific method, and researchers have been doing that for decades. The answers are unequivocally clear. There are no distinguishable differences between most of the mental disorders, even though they come with wildly different symptoms that require different treatments and different approaches. They impact people's lives in wildly different ways. The overwhelming amount of research, whether it's neuroimaging research or basic science research, where we take blood samples from these people, or we do EEGs on these people, although the symptoms are different, we can distinguish the diagnoses based on what they tell us and the symptoms that we see exhibited. When we actually do a deep dive into the science, even the genetics of these disorders, genes are a very clear, concrete biological thing. One gene can confer risk for numerous different disorders. When we use the scientific method to try to distinguish these disorders, what the science overwhelmingly tells us is they are not different disorders. That is precisely why the National Institutes of Health abandoned DSM over a decade ago and have acknowledged these are not valid constructs, and we're not going to make progress if we continue to pretend that they are.
Let me share a quick story, and it's a jumping off point for you. I think you're going to see where you can jump off from, and you can choose to how you want to jump off from this story. Back in the day, a family member of mine, early 1970s, let's say 1972, this individual, as a 4-year-old, was having mini seizures. Seizures where, let's say, another family member had to perform CPR and make sure this individual stayed alive. Happened many times. Finally, they got a diagnosis, and it was an interesting condition. Some doctor proposed a solution, and the solution was the keto diet. So we're talking 1972. Guess what? The seizures stopped. It's an interesting jumping off point, I think, for your work, isn't it?
That's an amazing story. You told it as though it's a real story.
It is.
It's pretty coincidental based on, I think, what you probably know about my work. I will say, for the record, your family and this individual are extraordinarily lucky that they had a brilliant doctor who knew that the ketogenic diet was a treatment option and actually volunteered it or offered it as an option. Because still to this day, in 2022, numerous children and adolescents seize every single day, multiple times a day, and are not given the option, are not informed about the powerful effectiveness of the ketogenic diet to stop their seizures. I don't know how you all came upon a brilliant doctor who not only knew about this, but recommended it. Yes, it's a perfect segue for what really started me on an entirely new path to understanding and ultimately treating mental illness. I've been an academic psychiatrist, Harvard Medical School for over 27 years now. I'm actually the director of continuing education at what's now ranked the #1 psychiatric hospital in the United States. Quite familiar with our field and with our conventions in the field and how we think about mental illness. All of that was abruptly challenged for me in 2016 when one of my patients asked for my help to lose weight. We decided to try the ketogenic diet. That time, actually, I did not know, even as a psychiatrist, I did not know the ketogenic diet was an evidence-based treatment for epilepsy, as your family's doctor knew decades ago. I was never taught about it. I just knew it as an effective weight loss intervention and also as an intervention to be used for type 2 diabetes. My patient was a 33-year-old man with schizoaffective disorder. He had daily hallucinations and delusions. He was tormented by his illness. He had tried 17 different medications. None of them stopped his symptoms. They did cause him to gain over 100 pounds. Weighing 340 pounds, he asked for my help to lose weight, and we tried the keto diet. Within 2 weeks...
Was that random?
It was not random. I had had 20 years of experience with low carb and keto diets for weight loss. And I had been using it actually in clinical practice and with treatment-resistant depression for quite a while, and was actually noticing it was quite powerful as an antidepressant. But this man had schizoaffective disorder. Those are very different disorders, of course. Hallucinations and delusions are very different than depression. I had no conception that this was going to do anything for any of his psychiatric symptoms. Somebody had said to me 7 years ago, before I did this, that this diet might actually help his schizoaffective disorder. I would have said, "You're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. This is a serious brain disorder. This ruins people's lives. People have these disorders for life. Even with the best treatments, they're horrible, debilitating illnesses. There's no way a diet is going to do anything for this disorder." That's what I would have said. So anyway, this man decides to give it a try. He's on the keto diet. Within 2 weeks, he's starting to lose weight. And I begin to notice this antidepressant effect. He starts making better eye contact with me. He's much more engaged. He's talking more. And I noticed, oh, there's this antidepressant effect that I've seen in other patients. That's really curious. I wasn't really expecting it in him. He's got a very different disorder. Isn't that nice? He's losing weight and he's a little happier. That's great. He was still psychotic, though. He was still hallucinating and had horrible delusions. It took about 6 to 8 weeks. But within 6 to 8 weeks, he spontaneously reported to me that his long-standing auditory hallucinations were beginning to go away and that he could start to ignore them now, and that his longstanding paranoid delusions were also going away. He had all of these paranoid conspiracy theories that there were these families that had targeted him, the very wealthy, powerful families in the world, and they had targeted him. And they had all this technology that could control his thoughts and broadcast his thoughts to other people. Everybody in the world somehow was in on this scheme. He was terrified to go out in public because he always was convinced that everybody was looking at him. Everybody was part of the conspiracy. And he began to realize that these beliefs weren't true and probably never had been. This man went on to lose over 160 pounds and has kept it off to this day. He was able to do things that he had not been able to do since the time of his diagnosis. He was able to complete a certificate program, go out in public without being terrified, and he was even able to perform improv in front of a live audience. Initially, I was dumbfounded and flabbergasted. That experience sent me on a journey to understand what on earth just happened.
As a casual observer, and I'm thinking about, okay, I've never had that kind of a weight issue. Let's say I've swung 20 or 30 pounds. I'm thinking, what happens to me when I'm in good shape? Well, you have more confidence. So the personal feeling of well-being, depending on people's desires. I mean, let's say this guy really likes the ladies. All of a sudden, you might be getting more attention. Then how do you feel? So now you've got some confidence just by looking in the mirror, and then maybe some attention from other people. Well, I mean, it seems like half the battle. It seems like you're already on the path. You and I know without even saying it yet. My gosh, here I am right now. I'm calling you from the least obese country in the world. You're currently in the most obese country in the world per capita. And my gosh, if your kind of work, if your kind of thinking could break through the stranglehold. You mentioned all the different drugs he had taken, but let's just talk about somebody that just might be depressed and they immediately get onto an antidepressant. Your work is showing that we're kind of going down a path that's really counterproductive, aren't we? It makes me sad because it's like, wow, so many people are led astray and they don't necessarily have that internal drive to figure it out, or they're trusting other smart people, they're trusting doctors, etc. We've got ourselves a mess today, don't we?
We do. As a psychiatrist who's been in this field for 27 years, I can only say, even the way you said it is just such a gross understatement. For those who don't know, mental disorders are an escalating crisis in the world. And the COVID-19 pandemic actually accelerated the crisis. But we were already seeing exponential increases in the rates of mental disorders prior to the pandemic. This is across the board for all mental disorders. Rates of autism have tripled in the past 20 years. Rates of bipolar disorder have at least doubled in adults. Rates of serious mental disorders, including bipolar, but other disorders, have doubled in young people just over about a 15-year period. Mental disorders are now the leading cause of disability, not only in the United States, but on the planet. The reason mental disorders are the leading cause of disability is not because people don't have access to treatment. It is because our treatments fail to work for far too many people. Again, I just want to say, I am a Harvard psychiatrist. I represent the conservative part of our profession. I very much believe psychiatry is a real thing. I believe psychiatric disorders decimate people's lives. And I know that treatment sometimes does work for people. I'm not here to completely bash the mental health field or say that our treatments are completely worthless. The statistics I shared with you are real. We have to confront those. We have to confront the reality that our current approach to understanding and treating mental illness is grossly inadequate. We need to do better. We need to do a better job of both understanding what mental illness is. We need to do a better job of addressing it and putting it into remission. I won't say the word cure. Wouldn't that be nice if we could cure it? Instead of using the word cure, I'll use the word remission. That we should be able to put these disorders into remission and allow people to no longer have any symptoms and allow them to go on with their lives. Right now, our field is failing miserably on these fronts.
Luckily, I can avoid the nightly news and I can avoid the cable news shows being 8,000 miles away from you. I know when I'm in the States and I see those channels, I know who sponsors those channels, and I know how much money there is to be made from big pharma. How do you, and I'm sure you have peers, some peers at least, I know there's a lot of peers that are supporting your work and saying, hey, this is great stuff, but I'm sure you're going to have some peers that have spent a lifetime in the field, getting the training, working with big pharma, prescribing assorted medications, perhaps to thousands upon thousands of patients. What do you do when a sizable population of smart people who want to help other people, perhaps for decades, have been using the wrong help? Frankly, a lot of the help coming from for-profit big pharma. Again, it's messy, isn't it?
It is messy. I will say this. I'm not here to discredit any of those people. The psychiatrists, the neuroscientists who did that research, or the pharmaceutical companies and biotech industry. As far as I'm concerned, they were all doing good work.
The best they could at that time?
The best that they could. The reality is, right now, the majority of people on this planet, including the top neuroscientists and psychiatrists, will say that nobody knows what causes mental illness. All we know are all of these different factors. We know about neurotransmitters, hormones, genetics, but we also know about psychological and social factors, trauma, stress. We know about substance use. We know about societal views of thinness as they relate to eating disorders. We know about all of these factors that can play a role in mental illness, but nobody knows how they all fit together. Nobody knows how those factors converge in different people to result in these brain disorders that we call mental disorders. Everybody's been doing their best. They've been just shooting in the dark, looking for anything that might help these people whose lives are decimated sometimes. Even if their lives aren't decimated, people are suffering. They want help and they're begging for help.
One more tough question about the industry. You're out with a perspective. There's other peers of yours that have similar perspectives, but you're out with a perspective. People have to pay attention now. You're at Harvard. People know about your work. They know you. At what point in time do we say, okay, we tried all this for decades. Now we've got a new understanding. If psychiatrists and big pharma don't pivot when people like yourself come along, then what? And I have to imagine that given the amount of money there is to be made, some people don't want to pivot when a guy like you walks into the room and shares your research.
My research is what is called disruptive. A disruptive innovation. Some people will use that term.
This is such a diplomatic conversation so far, really. We could go very hardcore if we want. You seem like a very nice guy, but we could go very hardcore on the industry, so to speak, right now if we wanted to. We're being very diplomatic.
We could. And the reality is that I actually really authentically believe a lot of what I'm saying. I think that I know people in the industry. They really do have good intentions. They've had good intentions all along. Many of them have had family members decimated by mental disorders as well. They have wanted to find better treatments. So they've developed new medications that seem to decrease symptoms. Nobody knew exactly why the medications were working or how they were working. There's all this debate about, is it a chemical imbalance? Are we affecting neurotransmitters? Are we blocking receptors?
Some recent news about that. About antidepressants in particular, yeah.
A lot of recent news. And it's interesting because I covered this in my book before that news broke, because any neuroscientist working in the field should have known for the last 15 to 20 years. The chemical imbalance theory of depression has pretty much been proven incorrect for at least 15 to 20 years. We can't find a chemical imbalance in the brain or the body that we can measure that distinguishes people with depression from people who don't have depression. That's been known for a long time, but there was an influential paper that got a lot of press a couple months ago that basically reviewed all of those decades of research and essentially said this chemical imbalance theory is a sham. Wake up, people. It's not true. And for whatever reason, the press decided to pick up on it this time around.
Until the next news cycle.
Yeah.
Let me shift you into your wheelhouse. We've hinted at some solutions and we've laid this groundwork of a not so pretty landscape. Let me give you the softball question to walk into, talking about metabolism and mitochondria. Why foundational to keeping our brains healthy? Because everyone that's listening right now, the reason they're going to want to go dive into your work beyond just hearing the horror stories of things maybe not working right, or we tried this and it's not working, you actually have a solution. You have ideas, concrete ways that people can make change in terms of their brain health. That's a nice statement.
It is. Thank you for that leading question. In a nutshell, I just mentioned a little bit ago that right now, and for many, many decades, nobody can for sure say what causes mental illness. We only know about these disparate factors, biological, psychological, and social factors, but nobody knows how they all fit together. What I am asserting in this book, Brain Energy, is a new comprehensive and unifying theory that connects all of these different factors. So I'm not creating a brand new theory out of the blue. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm looking at all of the decades of research that have been done, and I have pieced them together. And in a nutshell, the soundbite of the theory is that mental disorders are metabolic disorders of the brain. Now, in order to understand what that means, you have to understand metabolism. Metabolism is a lot more complicated than most people realize. Some people think of it as burning calories, and yeah, kinda, it is a little bit about burning calories. But I'm here to tell you, metabolism is so much more than that. In some ways, metabolism is fundamental to the definition of life. From that perspective, a lot of neuroscientists or researchers are going to say, well, Chris Palmer, come on, duh. You're just saying that mental disorders are somehow related to life. Big deal. You're not telling us anything that we didn't already know. That's no big deal. It's like saying mental disorders exist in the universe. So what? In fact, if you do a deep dive into metabolism and you ask just basic common sense questions, what does the term metabolic disorder mean? What does it mean, practically speaking? Like, how does obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, how do those things connect? What actually connects them? We call those metabolic disorders, but how are they connected at the cellular level? What does it mean if a cell is metabolically compromised? What does that mean at the cellular level? And what are the consequences of metabolic compromise in a cell? When you ask questions like that, you have to go to these tiny little things in our cells called mitochondria. Most people know mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, but I am here to tell you they are so much more than that. They actually play primary roles in the way the human body functions and the way that cells function. And when you do a deep dive into the science of mitochondria, and a lot of this is brand new science, it's still emerging every day now, but it has really exploded over the last 20 years. So prior to 20 years ago, nobody knew any of this. And that's one of the reasons this theory is so exciting, is because this theory calls upon decades and decades of existing science and research but it integrates with this cutting edge science of metabolism and mitochondria. And when you understand the science of it, you can actually connect the dots of mental illness. You can understand why people with mental disorders have higher levels of inflammation. You can understand why they might have hormonal dysregulation like cortisol levels. You can understand why they would have neurotransmitter dysregulation, which goes along with the chemical imbalance theory. You can understand how the gut microbiome plays a role. You can understand all of these different elements, but also psychological and social factors. You can understand how trauma and stress impact cells and metabolism and mitochondria, and how that can result in what we call mental illness or a mental disorder. When you rise above all of the noise and all of the complexity, and you see this big picture of metabolism and mitochondria, new solutions become obvious. So in the same way that obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease are actually all complicated disorders, if you look into the science of any of them, they're quite complicated. But if you rise above it and say, how can somebody prevent or address or treat obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, the solutions become simple. They are things like dietary interventions, exercise, sleep regulation, stress reduction, but also psychological and social things, having meaning and purpose in your life, having good relationships, managing substance use. All of these play a role in obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And what I'm here to say is that all of those same things play a role in what we call mental disorders. In the same way that people can prevent or treat those other metabolic disorders, we can prevent or treat horrible, debilitating brain disorders that we currently call schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and chronic depression.
Let me interject a thought here. Considering, we'll use America as an example, other countries have similar issues, but America was not always as obese as it is. These particular conditions on the physical and mental side were not as prevalent at one time. Because if we were to go back in time, and I don't know where we can start, and the data might be sketchy, but I got to figure that many of these mental health issues before America changed physically were probably far less. Maybe that's pre-industrial revolution, pre-mass food producing. With the 40s and 50s, it all became like frozen food. How we got that idea was a good idea. I'll never know. Quick and dirty way to do things, so to speak. Have you done work in the sense of trying to figure out where we were, let's say, a century ago on the mental health side of the equation?
Yes. I actually just get to call upon many other scholars' research. Many people have looked at this issue. There are people who have looked at the rates of mental illness since the Industrial Revolution and have argued that disorders, even like schizophrenia, are up 5-fold since the Industrial Revolution began. It's long been known as we see changes in societies, as societies become modern or westernized, it's long been known that what follows are these diseases of affluence. Sometimes that's a term that gets used. Usually people think of the diseases or disorders of affluence as the metabolic disorders, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and also cancer. Rates of all of those disorders go up. If we go into a quote unquote primitive culture where people are hunting and gathering and living fairly simple farming lives, they're usually actually quite healthy. Unfortunately, because those countries are often impoverished, they might have food scarcity. They may not have access to antibiotic treatments. They may not have access to clean water. So those people don't necessarily live long lives because they might be dying from infections or starvation. But as a rule of thumb, they are not suffering from obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. So this is well established. This is well known. What's less known is that mental disorders are part of that picture. numerous researchers have identified this pattern. Now, people get all worked up about it. They think that, well, some people think that it's a real thing, and they think that it's maybe the stress of overcrowding. Others think maybe it is environmental toxins. When countries westernize, it means that we're getting more chemicals in the country, not only in the food supply, but also for labor. You're working in factories that are using solvents and other chemicals. Those chemicals are going into the ground, which end up in the water supply. Workers are being exposed to those chemicals. Those have been one of the leading theories for why do cancer rates go up so much when countries westernize. The rates of mental illness are also increasing. And again, people have all these theories. Is it the chemicals? Is it the stress of overcrowding? Is it city life? I am here to tell you that it is the exact same thing, whatever that is causing the obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. These are all interrelated metabolic disorders. The mental disorders just happen to affect the brain more than the heart or the pancreas or some other organ.
Why do you think, given your stature, your university that you're associated with, many other peers, we can sit here and have this honest conversation? If we just use, for example, obesity, you don't want to go down this path. I mean, we learned this during COVID. We can talk about diabetes, heart disease, all kinds of other issues. And of course, now you bringing up the mental health. It's very frustrating to watch America win. The powers that be know what you are saying is true. And then at the same time, where we have a population of people that just desperately need to shed weight for an assortment of reasons, primarily physical and mental health, we're celebrating in many ways the obesity. We are saying it's okay. And it's like, I'm not saying people need to be shamed. My gosh, it's kind of like if you got a small child and the child has one donut, maybe one's enough. Maybe he doesn't need 10. How do we get around that? Because here you are, you're at perhaps the finest, most affluent university in the world. You're saying stuff that just seems to me, okay, I've been around the block a little, great common sense in many ways. But at the same time, we've got a population of folks that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and somewhat celebrating the physical side of things. That's just going to make their life so much more difficult. How do we attack this problem?
I think one of the issues, just one, I mean, there are so many issues that we could try to unpack or look at. One of the issues that's very much related to everything that you just said is this concept of fat shaming. Research shows it, and a lot of people just know intuitively that if you are overweight or obese, you're more likely to have anxiety, depression, burnout, or just feel like you're living a less than life. You're living a second-class life. And a lot of people immediately assume it's due to social and psychological factors. It's everybody fat shaming them. It's the fact that they don't have access to dating, or at least not the dating pool that they would like to have access to. Or maybe they're discriminated against on social media. Maybe they're discriminated against at school or in other places. And that if we just stopped discriminating against these people, if we just accepted that some people are larger than others, everybody would be fine. I am here to tell people that in and of itself is not the whole story. Does fat shaming impact people's mental health? Of course it does. Does bullying and teasing a child because he or she is overweight or fat, does that impact that child's mental health? Of course it does. We all know it. Should that be happening? No, it should not be happening. But that is only a tiny part of the story, folks. The much larger part of the story is physiology and biology. We need to understand at the cellular level what is happening in this person's body, given that is either causing the obesity, because that's one of the ways I think about it. It's not that people are lazy slobs, overindulging, and then they become obese. In some cases, I think people develop metabolic problems in their bodies and brains even while they are still thin, those metabolic abnormalities influence feeding behavior, cravings, appetite, but they also influence metabolism and burning calories, so that the net result is that people gain weight and then become overweight or obese. We're not going to make progress in helping people be the happiest and healthiest and most productive human beings they can be if we ignore all of this science. We need to think more broadly than just about the social consequences of obesity.
Let me give a quick follow-up just to sharpen my pencil a little bit about how much of a fight your logic is up against. I can remember being a high school kid collecting SI swimsuit issues in the 1980s when I was in high school. And okay, Paulina Poroskova was on the front cover, a thin Czechoslovakian model. That was the perception of beauty at that time. You roll forward to the last 5 years, and Sports Illustrated has gone the complete opposite direction. Put ladies on their cover that, okay, perhaps they can manage the weight they're carrying now in their 20s, but they're not going to in the future. It just seems like this weird moment where we all instinctively know that the model in the 1980s, okay, some could say she was too skinny or whatever, but she probably wasn't. We all know instinctively that was the proper path. We're now this place where we've moved, as you just laid out some of the reasons why, we've moved to a place where the obesity percentage of a population has zoomed up. And now we've got this mainstream media telling everyone it's okay versus putting a copy of Brain Energy in everyone's hands.
I'm a psychiatrist. I honestly really don't care what people look like. I don't care if people are thin or overweight or obese. I don't care so much if people work out or don't work out.
But you're saying that philosophically because you know if they are carrying the extra weight, though, their percentage chance for having the mental health issues goes up dramatically.
That's what I was just going to say. So you're absolutely right. A lot of people would say, Chris Palmer, why do you care about people's weight? That's none of your business. You're a psychiatrist. Aren't you supposed to be stamping out mental illness? As a psychiatrist, that is my goal. My goal is to stamp out mental illness. My goal is to take human beings who are suffering, who are miserable, who are tormented by their symptoms, and they come to me begging for answers. They come to me begging for a pill that will stop their suffering, that will allow them to get a job and go on with their life. I am here to tell you, we cannot ignore the obesity epidemic, the diabetes and prediabetes epidemics. We cannot ignore these if we're going to help restore brain function in these people. They are inseparable. As a psychiatrist, I cannot look the other way to people's weight. It's not because I care, quote unquote, about how they look or whether they're going to be able to be a model or not. I see obesity as a symptom. I don't see it as a cause. I see it as a symptom. It is a symptom of metabolic problems in that person's body and brain.
Try and take it from a general standpoint. The root metabolic problem that's caused a country like America to see its obesity rates shoot up, its mental health problems shoot up. What is one of those root metabolic issues, or perhaps the most important one? Or is it even known?
I argue in Brain Energy, and I think numerous other researchers, cutting edge biotech companies, billionaire investors are in this space. I'm not alone. And those people will probably say, who the hell is this Chris Palmer? Why is he trying to take credit for all of the work we've done over decades? I know that's what some of them are going to say, and that's okay. And I accept that. I am taking their work. I am using their work to support this theory. And I wouldn't have a theory if it wasn't for those people. So let me give credit where credit is due. I am simply climbing up on their shoulders and all of the work that they've done, using it to support what I'm arguing. But what I would argue, to answer your question, is all of it is about mitochondria and mitochondrial dysfunction or dysregulation. The only way you can understand obesity is by understanding mitochondria. The only way you can understand mental illness is by understanding mitochondria. The only way you can understand cardiovascular disease is by understanding mitochondria. In a nutshell, what it means is that increasingly there is something in the environment on this planet that is adversely affecting the function of mitochondria in the human species. And that is resulting in all of these different quote unquote illnesses or diseases.
Is that something a choice though? For example, is it bad sleep habits? Is it lack of exercise, the diet issues, too much drinking, too many drugs? Is that what you're getting at? Or you're saying there's some unknown factor?
All of those things that you just listed absolutely play a role. And I go through the science, the detailed science, down to the cellular level of how all of those things impact mitochondria, which then impact metabolism, which then result in both metabolic and mental disorders. Each and every one of those factors that you just listed is directly linked through decades of research to the development of both mental and metabolic disorders. And that is why I'm asserting that mental disorders are, in fact, metabolic disorders. So many of these things are within our control. We do need to get good sleep. That means you should not have a screen flashing light into your eyes when you're supposed to be sleeping at night. Sleep is actually really important to metabolic and mental health. If you're not getting good sleep, you are harming yourself. And that is something easily changed. And maybe I shouldn't say easily because some people are really addicted to their screens.
Everyone's addicted these days.
You have to overcome that addiction. You have to recognize that it's having an adverse effect on your life and your health and your happiness and your productivity. And you have to make a decision and come up with a strategy to try to reduce it or manage it in an appropriate way.
We haven't talked about it yet today, but another one of these issues that's happening too, and I think the path that you go down buttresses this as well, is that aging is going to also vary depending on how one is making certain choices. Fair statement?
100%. For people who don't know, there's an entire exploding field of aging science. All of the aging scientists are zeroing in on mitochondria. And in fact, one of the leading aging science researchers, Dr. David Sinclair, who's also here at Harvard Medical School, recently published a paper in a very prestigious journal arguing that mitochondria are the only way to connect the dots of aging, of what all of the different factors that we know play a role in aging. Mitochondria are front and center to that process. We know that people who are obese are aging prematurely. We know that people with type 2 diabetes are aging prematurely. And interestingly, we also know with certainty that people with mental disorders, every single one of them, whether it's schizophrenia or depression or alcoholism or anorexia, even though those are all different disorders, all of those people are aging prematurely. And on average, they die early deaths. One of the beautiful things about this theory and about this new way to understand and treat mental illness is that we're not only going to be treating mental illness, that if we come up with effective treatments like diet, exercise, sleep, managing substance use, we're going to be restoring human health. We're going to be also at the same time addressing overweight or obesity. We're going to be addressing the risk for type 2 diabetes. We're going to be addressing the risk for cancer, the risk for cardiovascular disease, and the risk for premature aging. This strategy kills numerous birds with one stone, so to speak. We are addressing human health.
Does it ever strike you? I mean, of course, there's a lot of research here, a lot of very smart people spending a lot of time to get to the nitty gritty. But isn't it interesting that the so-called mom heuristics that we would have all heard growing up, or grandma heuristics, are ultimately still the solution? Watch your diet, don't drink too much alcohol, that kind of stuff. things that we know, and you guys have kind of come full circle to find, hey, this is where we need to be. And in some ways, maybe deep down, we always knew that.
Let me take it even a step further than you did. We can go much further back than just mom and grandma and their advice, but no question, they had it right. They knew. But in fact, we can go back to Hippocrates, who talked about first, do no harm. Make sure that whatever interventions you're doing are not actually harming people. But he also talked about diet and fasting and exercise as treatments, human illnesses, human conditions. And at the end of the day, after all of the neuroscience, after all of the genetic and epigenetic revolution that we've just been through, after all of that science, if you actually understand all of that detailed science and you put it together, you come up with solutions that Hippocrates was talking about millennia ago. It's a little unnerving that we had to do all this research only to come up with these great solutions that Hippocrates was touting and that our grandmothers and our mothers always knew anyway. This is common sense. I was just talking to a clinician the other day and she said, Chris, this is really amazing stuff, but it's like hidden. And I said, yeah, it's like hiding in plain sight. Been right in front of us all along. And yet nobody's talking about it. Nobody's recognizing it for what it is.
The book, Brain Energy, a revolutionary breakthrough in understanding mental health and improving treatment for anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, and more. As a guy who's written 7 books, you win the award for the longest subtitle. Great job on that.
Thanks.
We didn't talk about it in this conversation. I've talked about it on this show before. For me, it's really interesting. And one of the reasons I decided as a single guy to stay in a place like Vietnam is that when I came here, I was like, oh, wow, there is quite a difference in the physical aspect of people. It just reminds me of a distant time in America's history where you see very thin people. For me, I see that every day. So I watch how people in Vietnam, it's less food, it's less big bread, carbohydrates, a lot of that kind of stuff. But it's just interesting to see. That's a whole different conversation for your next book. We can dive into that again. Hey, Chris, is there a place you want to send people? I can find you at Harvard, but is there a website you would like to direct people to?
2 websites people could check out if they want. So one is chrispalmermd.com, which has a lot of information about myself. I hope people will go to brainenergy.com to learn how they can get involved.
I was kind of surprised when I first saw your book. I was like, well, my first thought was, I read the first little bit and I was like, okay, I can talk to this guy. This is going to be an easy conversation. I'm on the same page already. Great stuff though, Chris. I appreciate you coming on and giving me and my audience an education.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for hosting me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.